The story of Korea's division begins not with the dramatic events of the 1940s, but decades earlier, when the Korean Peninsula fell under the shadow of Japanese imperial ambition. To understand how one nation became two, we must first examine the brutal colonial period that would forever alter the Korean consciousness and plant the seeds of the peninsula's eventual partition. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, ending over 5 centuries of the Joseon dynasty and beginning what Koreans would remember as the darkest period in their nation's history. This was not merely a political takeover, but a systematic attempt to erase Korean identity itself. The Japanese colonial government, led by a series of governors general who ruled with absolute authority, implemented policies designed to transform Korea into an extension of Japan, both economically and culturally. The Joseon dynasty, which had ruled Korea since 1392, represented one of the world's longest, lasting monarchies. Under Joseon rule, Korea had developed a sophisticated Confucian-based administrative system, a rich literary tradition, and remarkable technological innovations, including movable metal-type printing centuries before its appearance in Europe. The dynasty had weathered numerous challenges, including devastating invasions by Japan in the 1590s and Manchu conquests in the 1600s, but had always maintained its essential Korean character and independence. The final decades of Joseon rule were marked by increasing pressure from foreign powers and internal reform movements. The opening of Korea to foreign trade in the 1870s, following the model of Japan's earlier opening, brought new ideas and technologies but also exposed Korea's military and economic weaknesses. Progressive Korean reformers, influenced by examples of modernization in Japan and China, attempted to implement sweeping changes in government, education, and military organization. But these efforts were hampered by conservative opposition and foreign interference. The early years of colonial rule were marked by what the Japanese called the military rule period, lasting until 1919. During this time, Korean political organizations were banned, freedom of speech was eliminated, and Japanese military police maintained order through fear and violence. The colonial government confiscated vast amounts of Korean land through the Land Survey Project, ostensibly to modernize agriculture, but in reality to transfer ownership to Japanese settlers and corporations. Korean farmers, many of whom had worked the same land for generations, suddenly found themselves landless tenants or were forced to migrate to Manchuria or Japan in search of work. The Land Survey Project was particularly devastating because it disrupted traditional Korean concepts of land ownership and community organization. Korean villages had often operated under complex systems of collective ownership and mutual obligation that had evolved over centuries. Japanese colonial administrators, applying Western legal concepts of individual property ownership, frequently failed to recognize these traditional arrangements, resulting in the legal dispossession of entire communities. Families who had farmed the same plots for generations discovered that they had no legal claim to their ancestral lands under the new colonial legal system. The displacement of Korean farmers created massive social disruption throughout the peninsula. Rural communities that had maintained stable populations for centuries suddenly found themselves emptied as residents fled to seek work in Japanese-controlled mines and factories, or migrated to Manchuria and other parts of the Japanese Empire. This rural exodus broke down traditional family structures and community networks that had been central to Korean social organization. Children grew up separated from their grandparents and extended families, losing connection to the oral traditions and cultural practices that had been passed down through generations. The cultural assault on Korean identity was perhaps even more devastating than the economic exploitation. The Japanese implemented a policy of cultural assimilation known as Naizanatai, meaning Japan and Korea as one body. Korean language instruction in schools was gradually reduced and eventually eliminated entirely. Students were required to speak only Japanese and adopt Japanese names. Traditional Korean customs, clothing, and even hairstyles were discouraged or banned. The colonial government attempted to rewrite Korean history, portraying the peninsula as a backward region that had always been dependent on more advanced neighbors and was naturally suited to Japanese rule. The assault on Korean language was particularly systematic and cruel. Korean had developed its own unique writing system, Hangul, created in the 15th century under King Sejong the Great. This alphabet was specifically designed to be accessible to common people, unlike the Chinese characters that had previously been used primarily by educated elites. Hangul represented one of Korea's greatest cultural achievements, but Japanese colonial authorities viewed it as a symbol of Korean nationalism that needed to be suppressed. Korean literature, poetry, and historical records written in Hangul were confiscated or destroyed, while Korean children were punished for speaking their native language, even in their homes. The prohibition on Korean names struck at the very heart of Korean family identity and ancestral traditions. Korean naming practices were deeply connected to Confucian concepts of family lineage and social relationships. Family names carried information about geographic origins, social status, and genealogical connections that stretched back centuries. Given names were carefully chosen to reflect parental hopes and to maintain harmony within the family's generational naming patterns. By forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names, colonial authorities were attempting to sever these cultural and familial connections, making it impossible for Koreans to maintain their traditional understanding of family identity and social relationships. The 1919 March 1st movement marked a turning point in Korean resistance to colonial rule. Inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination and emboldened by the end of World War I, Korean independence activists organized massive peaceful demonstrations across the peninsula. On March 1st, 33 prominent Korean leaders gathered in Seoul to read a declaration of independence, while thousands of citizens took to the streets in coordinated protests. The Japanese response was swift and brutal. Military, police, and soldiers fired into crowds of unarmed demonstrators, killing thousands and arresting tens of thousands more. The movement was crushed, but it had demonstrated the depth of Korean opposition to colonial rule and inspired a generation of independence activists. The March 1st movement was remarkable for its scope and organization, involving coordinated demonstrations in cities and towns throughout Korea and even among Korean communities in Manchuria, Japan, and the United States. The Declaration of Independence, written primarily by historian Chu Nam-seon, articulated Korean grievances against Japanese rule while also expressing hopes for peaceful coexistence with Japan after independence was achieved. The document reflected the influence of both traditional Korean political thought and modern democratic ideals, calling for Korea to take its place among the free nations of the world. The participants in the March 1st demonstrations represented a remarkable cross-section of Korean society. Students from schools and universities played leading roles, but they were joined by merchants, farmers, workers, and religious leaders from both Christian and Buddhist communities. Women participated in large numbers, often taking leadership roles in organizing demonstrations and maintaining morale when male leaders were arrested. The movement demonstrated that opposition to Japanese rule extended across all segments of Korean society and could not be dismissed as the work of a small group of radical agitators. The Japanese suppression of the March 1st movement was characterized by extraordinary brutality that shocked international observers and created lasting trauma within Korean society. Japanese military, police, and soldiers not only fired on peaceful demonstrators, but also conducted systematic campaigns of retaliation against communities that had participated in the protests. Entire villages were burned, suspected leaders were tortured and executed, and collective punishments were imposed on areas where demonstrations had occurred. The violence was so extreme that it generated criticism, even from some Japanese officials, who worried about the international implications of such harsh measures. Following the March 1st movement, Japan shifted to what it called cultural rule, allowing limited Korean cultural expression while maintaining tight political control. This period saw the emergence of Korean newspapers, literary magazines, and cultural organizations, though all operated under strict censorship. However, this apparent liberalization was largely superficial, designed to reduce international criticism while maintaining Japanese dominance. The colonial government continued to exploit Korean resources and labor, and any genuine political opposition remained strictly forbidden. The cultural rule period created complex dilemmas for Korean intellectuals and cultural leaders. While the relaxation of censorship allowed for some expression of Korean identity through literature, art, and scholarship, Participation in these activities required working within the colonial system and accepting Japanese oversight. Some Korean writers and scholars chose to focus on preserving and documenting Korean culture and history, believing that maintaining cultural continuity was essential for eventual independence. Others argued that any collaboration with the colonial system was morally compromising and that true Korean culture could only flourish after political liberation was achieved. Korean literature during this period reflected these tensions and dilemmas. Writers like Yi Kwang-soo and Kim Dong explored themes of national identity, modernization, and the psychological impact of colonial rule on individual Koreans. Their works often employed subtle allegory and symbolism to express ideas that could not be stated directly due to censorship restrictions. Poetry became a particularly important form of cultural resistance, with poets like Han Yong-un and Kim So-wool creating works that celebrated Korean landscapes, traditions, and values while lamenting the loss of independence. The economic transformation of Korea under Japanese rule was dramatic, but came at enormous human cost. Japan invested heavily in infrastructure, building railways, ports, and factories, but these developments primarily served Japanese economic interests rather than Korean welfare. Korean rice was exported to Japan while Koreans themselves often faced food shortages. The colonial government established heavy industries, particularly in the northern regions rich in mineral resources, but management positions were reserved for Japanese nationals, while Koreans provided cheap labor under harsh conditions. The railway system constructed by the Japanese was particularly significant because it fundamentally altered Korean economic and social relationships. Traditional Korean transportation had relied on networks of roads and waterways that connected local markets and communities in patterns that had evolved over centuries. The Japanese railway system, by contrast, was designed primarily to facilitate the extraction of Korean resources and their shipment to Japan. Railway lines ran from mining and agricultural areas to ports, rather than connecting Korean cities and towns to each other. This transportation network reinforced Korea's colonial status as a supplier of raw materials rather than promoting balanced economic development. The development of heavy industry in northern Korea created new social classes and relationships that would have profound implications for Korea's post-liberation politics. Japanese investment in steel production, chemical manufacturing, and hydroelectric power generation required large numbers of skilled workers and technicians. While Japanese nationals held most management positions, Koreans gradually acquired technical skills and industrial experience that would prove valuable after liberation. However, this industrial development also created stark regional differences between the more industrialized North and the predominantly agricultural South, differences that would complicate efforts to create a unified Korean economy after independence. The colonial government's agricultural policies were designed to maximize rice production for export to Japan, often at the expense of Korean food security and nutritional needs. Japanese agricultural experts introduced new rice varieties and farming techniques that increased yields. But the benefits of this increased production flowed primarily to Japanese consumers rather than Korean farmers. Korean farmers were required to sell their rice to government purchasing agencies at fixed prices that were often below market rates, while being forced to purchase inferior grains for their own consumption. This system created chronic malnutrition in many rural areas while generating profits for Japanese trading companies. As Japan's military ambitions expanded in the 1930s, Korea became increasingly important as a source of raw materials and manpower for the Japanese war machine. The colonial government intensified its assimilation policies, now calling them Kominka, or the transformation of Koreans into imperial subjects. Korean students were required to worship at Shinto shrines, violating their traditional Buddhist and Confucian beliefs. The use of Korean names was banned entirely, forcing all Koreans to adopt Japanese names in a policy that struck at the heart of Korean family identity and ancestral traditions. The Kominka policies represented the most intensive phase of Japanese efforts to eliminate Korean identity and transform Koreans into loyal Japanese subjects. These policies went far beyond earlier assimilation efforts, attempting to reshape Korean consciousness at the most fundamental levels. Koreans were required to participate in daily rituals of emperor worship, recite Japanese patriotic songs and pledges, and demonstrate their loyalty to the Japanese Empire through various forms of public performance. Failure to participate enthusiastically in these activities could result in punishment, job loss, or worse forms of retaliation. The requirement to worship at Shinto shrines created particular difficulties for Korean Christians, who viewed such practices as idolatry that violated their religious beliefs. Korean Christian leaders faced agonizing choices between maintaining their faith and protecting their congregations from persecution. Some chose to resist openly, accepting imprisonment and persecution as the price of religious integrity. Others attempted to find compromises that would allow them to maintain their Christian faith while avoiding direct confrontation with colonial authorities. These dilemmas created lasting divisions within Korean Christian communities that would persist long after liberation. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and later the Pacific War brought unprecedented hardship to Korea. The colonial government implemented total mobilization policies, conscripting Korean men for military service and forcing hundreds of thousands of Korean workers to labor in Japanese mines, factories, and construction projects under brutal conditions. Perhaps most tragically, tens of thousands of Korean women were deceived or coerced into sexual slavery as comfort women for the Japanese military, a crime that would remain a source of diplomatic tension for decades to come. The mobilization of Korean labor for the Japanese war effort reached extraordinary levels during the Pacific War years. Entire Korean communities were disrupted as men were conscripted for military service or forced labor, while women and children were left to maintain households and farms with minimal resources. Korean workers were transported throughout the Japanese Empire, from coal mines in Japan to construction projects in Southeast Asia, often under conditions that amounted to slavery. Many of these workers never returned to Korea, dying from overwork, malnutrition, disease, or Allied bombing attacks on Japanese industrial facilities. The systematic exploitation of Korean women as comfort women represents one of the most horrific aspects of Japanese colonial rule. Young Korean women were recruited through deception, coercion, and outright kidnapping to serve as sex slaves for Japanese military personnel. These women, many of whom were teenagers, were held in military brothels throughout the Japanese Empire under conditions of extreme brutality and degradation. The Japanese military attempted to destroy records of this system as the war ended, and many survivors were too traumatized or ashamed to speak publicly about their experiences for decades. The comfort women issue would become a major source of tension between Korea and Japan in the post-war period, with Korean survivors demanding acknowledgement, apology, and compensation for their suffering. The systematic exploitation of Korean labor reached its peak during the Pacific War years. Entire Korean families were uprooted and sent to work in Japanese factories or mines, often in dangerous conditions with inadequate food and shelter. The colonial government stripped Korea of its resources, including food, metals, and even cultural artifacts, to support the Japanese war effort. Korean students were mobilized for labor service instead of attending school, and Korean intellectuals faced increasing surveillance and persecution. The requisitioning of Korean cultural artifacts and historical treasures represented a particularly painful form of cultural destruction. Japanese authorities confiscated ancient Korean artworks, historical documents, religious objects, and family heirlooms, claiming they were needed to support the war effort through their metal content or other materials. In reality, many of these items were of minimal material value but held enormous cultural and spiritual significance for Korean families and communities. The loss of these irreplaceable cultural treasures created wounds that would never fully heal, representing not just material loss, but the severing of connections to Korean history and identity. The disruption of Korean education during the war years had devastating, long-term consequences for Korean intellectual and cultural development. Schools were converted to military training facilities or weapons production centers, while students were assigned to work in factories, farms, or construction projects. An entire generation of Korean youth grew up with minimal formal education, creating knowledge gaps that would handicap Korea's post-liberation development efforts. Libraries were closed, books were burned or confiscated, and Korean scholars were prevented from conducting research or publishing their work. Despite the oppression, Korean resistance movements continued to operate both within the peninsula and in exile. In China, Korean independence activists formed the Korean Provisional Government, led by figures like Kim Gu and Syngman Rhee, who would later play crucial roles in post-liberation Korea. Communist-oriented resistance groups, including those led by Kim Il-sung in Manchuria, conducted guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces. These resistance movements, though they achieved limited military success, kept the flame of Korean independence alive and provided leadership cadres for the post-liberation period. The Korean Provisional Government, established in Shanghai in 1919 following the March 1st movement, represented Korean aspirations for democratic self-governance and international recognition. The Provisional Government attempted to function as a legitimate Korean state in exile, establishing diplomatic relations with sympathetic foreign governments, organizing resistance activities, and preparing for eventual liberation. However, the Provisional Government was hampered by limited resources, internal political divisions, and the difficulty of maintaining effective communication with resistance groups inside Korea. The communist resistance movement in Manchuria developed along different lines, focusing on guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces rather than diplomatic activities. Kim Il-sung and other communist leaders gained valuable military experience fighting alongside Chinese communist forces against both Japanese troops and Chinese nationalist forces. These guerrilla campaigns, while limited in scope, provided important training for Korean communist leaders and demonstrated that effective resistance to Japanese rule was possible. The harsh conditions of guerrilla warfare also created strong bonds of loyalty and shared sacrifice among communist resistance fighters that would prove important in post-liberation political struggles. The experience of Japanese colonial rule profoundly shaped Korean national consciousness in ways that would influence the peninsula's division. The brutality of colonial policies created a deep reservoir of anti-Japanese sentiment that united Koreans across class and regional lines. However, the resistance movements developed along different ideological lines, with some groups embracing democratic ideals influenced by Western thought, while others adopted communist ideology as a means of achieving both national liberation and social revolution. These ideological divisions, largely suppressed during the colonial period by the common struggle against Japanese rule, would become critically important after liberation. The colonial experience also created complex attitudes toward modernization and foreign influence that would shape post-liberation Korean politics. Japanese colonial rule had brought modern technology, industrial development, and new forms of social organization to Korea, but these changes had come at the cost of Korean independence and cultural identity. After liberation, Koreans would face difficult questions about how to pursue modernization and development while maintaining their cultural autonomy and national sovereignty. Different Korean political groups would offer competing answers to these questions, contributing to the ideological divisions that would ultimately lead to national partition. The colonial period also created significant social and economic changes that would complicate post-liberation reconstruction. Japanese industrial development had created a small but significant Korean working class, particularly in the northern regions where heavy industry was concentrated. At the same time, the destruction of traditional agricultural relationships had created a large population of landless farmers and urban poor. The Japanese had also created a Korean administrative and professional class that had collaborated with colonial rule, creating divisions between those who had resisted and those who had accommodated themselves to Japanese authority. The question of collaboration with Japanese colonial rule would become one of the most contentious issues in post-liberation Korean politics. Koreans who had served in the colonial administration, worked for Japanese companies, or otherwise cooperated with colonial authorities, faced accusations of treason and betrayal from their fellow Koreans. However, the reality was that survival under colonial rule had required various forms of accommodation and compromise that made simple judgments about collaboration versus resistance difficult to sustain. Many Koreans had been forced to make impossible choices between protecting their families and maintaining their principles, creating moral ambiguities that would complicate post-liberation efforts at national reconciliation. As the Pacific War turned against Japan, Korean hopes for liberation grew stronger. The Cairo Declaration of 1943, in which the United States, Britain, and China promised Korean independence, in due course, raised expectations that liberation was approaching. However, the vague language of "in due course" would prove prophetic, as the great powers had not agreed on specific plans for Korean independence or the transition period that would follow Japanese defeat. The Cairo Declaration represented the first major international commitment to Korean independence, but its vague language reflected the great powers' uncertainty about post-war arrangements in East Asia. American, British, and Chinese leaders were focused primarily on defeating Japan and had given limited thought to the specific challenges of Korean liberation and reconstruction. The promise of independence, in due course, satisfied immediate diplomatic needs without committing the Allies to specific timelines or procedures for Korean self-governance. Korean independence activists in exile closely analyzed every word of the Cairo Declaration and subsequent Allied statements, searching for clues about liberation prospects and post-war arrangements. The declaration's emphasis on Korean independence eventually, rather than immediately upon Japanese defeat, suggested that the Allies envisioned some form of transitional period during which Korea would remain under foreign supervision. This prospect was deeply troubling to Korean leaders who had expected immediate independence after decades of colonial rule. The final months of Japanese rule saw increasing desperation as Japan's position became hopeless. The colonial government attempted to mobilize every possible Korean resource for the war effort, while also preparing for the possibility of defeat. Some Japanese officials began destroying records of colonial administration, while others attempted to position themselves for a possible transition period. Korean resistance groups, sensing that liberation was approaching, began preparing for the post-colonial period and the enormous challenges it would bring. The destruction of colonial records represented a deliberate attempt to obscure the extent of Japanese exploitation and atrocities in Korea. Colonial administrators burned documents detailing forced labor programs, comfort women recruitment, cultural suppression policies, and economic exploitation schemes. This destruction of evidence would later complicate efforts to achieve justice for colonial period crimes and would contribute to ongoing disputes between Korea and Japan over historical responsibility and compensation for colonial period damages. Korean resistance groups used the final months of colonial rule to establish networks and prepare for the transition to independence. Communist and non-communist resistance organizations began recruiting new members, stockpiling weapons and supplies, and developing plans for post-liberation political activities. These preparations would prove crucial in the chaotic period immediately following Japanese surrender, when various Korean groups would compete for political influence and legitimacy. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, Koreans throughout the peninsula erupted in celebration. After 35 years of colonial rule, Korea was finally free. However, this joy would prove short-lived, as the circumstances of liberation would soon create new divisions that would prove even more enduring than Japanese rule. The Korean Peninsula was about to enter a new phase of its history, one that would see the emergence of two separate Korean states locked in permanent confrontation. The moment of liberation was marked by spontaneous celebrations throughout Korea as news of Japanese surrender spread. Koreans took to the streets in massive demonstrations of joy, tearing down Japanese flags and symbols while raising Korean flags that had been hidden for decades. Political prisoners were released from jails, Korean-language newspapers began publishing again, and families separated by colonial policies attempted to reunite. For a brief moment, it seemed that Korea's long nightmare was finally over and that the nation could begin rebuilding itself as a free and independent country. However, the euphoria of liberation quickly gave way to uncertainty and anxiety as Koreans realized that their country's future remained unclear. Japanese colonial authorities had maintained order through force and repression, and their sudden removal created a power vacuum that various Korean groups rushed to fill. Local people's committees formed spontaneously in many areas, attempting to maintain basic services and security. But these grassroots organizations lacked the resources and authority needed to govern effectively during the transition period. The liberation of Korea came not through Korean resistance efforts alone, but as a consequence of Japan's defeat in the Pacific War. This fact would prove crucial in determining Korea's post-liberation fate. Unlike other colonized nations that achieved independence through their own liberation struggles, Korea's freedom came through the victory of external powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. These two emerging superpowers would play decisive roles in shaping post-liberation Korea, bringing with them the ideological conflicts that were already beginning to define the post-war world order. The immediate aftermath of Japanese surrender created a power vacuum throughout Korea. Japanese colonial administrators, military personnel, and civilians found themselves suddenly without authority, while Korean political leaders who had been suppressed or exiled for decades began to emerge and organize. Local people's committees formed spontaneously in many areas, attempting to maintain order and begin the process of self-governance. However, these grassroots efforts would soon be overshadowed by the arrival of occupying forces from the United States and Soviet Union. The formation of local people's committees represented genuine Korean efforts at democratic self-governance during the immediate post-liberation period. These committees, which emerged in cities and towns throughout Korea, attempted to maintain essential services, distribute food and supplies, and establish basic law and order in the absence of functioning government authority. Many committees were led by respected local figures who had maintained their credibility during the colonial period, and they often reflected the political diversity of their communities, including both conservative and leftist elements. However, the people's committees faced enormous challenges that limited their effectiveness. They lacked financial resources, administrative experience, and legal authority to address the complex problems created by colonial rule and wartime disruption. Many committees were also divided by political disagreements between members who favored different approaches to post-liberation reconstruction and governance. Despite these limitations, the People's Committees represented important expressions of Korean democratic aspirations and provided valuable experience in self-governance for many future Korean political leaders. The decision to divide Korea along the 38th parallel was made hastily by American military planners in the final days of the Pacific War. As Soviet forces advanced rapidly through Manchuria and into northern Korea, American officials feared that the entire peninsula might fall under Soviet control. The 38th parallel was chosen almost arbitrarily as a temporary boundary for accepting Japanese surrender, with American forces responsible for the area south of the line and Soviet forces responsible for the north. This division was intended to be temporary, lasting only until a unified Korean government could be established, but it would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in modern Korean history. The choice of the 38th parallel as the dividing line reflected American military convenience rather than Korean political, economic, or cultural realities. The parallel had no historical significance in Korean affairs and cut across traditional administrative boundaries, transportation networks, and family relationships. The line separated Seoul, Korea's capital and largest city, from much of its traditional hinterland, while also dividing families and communities that had been unified for centuries. American planners gave little consideration to these Korean concerns, focusing instead on the immediate military necessity of preventing Soviet occupation of the entire peninsula. The 38th parallel division also created significant economic problems by separating Korea's industrial north from its agricultural south. Japanese colonial development had created complementary economic relationships between different regions of Korea, with northern areas specializing in heavy industry and mining while southern regions focused on agriculture and light manufacturing. The division disrupted these relationships, creating shortages and economic difficulties in both zones that would complicate post-liberation reconstruction efforts. The arrival of American and Soviet occupation forces marked the beginning of Korea's transformation from a unified colony into a divided peninsula. The two occupying powers brought with them fundamentally different visions for Korea's future, reflecting the broader ideological struggle between capitalism and communism that was emerging in the post-war world. Neither occupation force was particularly well prepared for the complex task of governing Korea, and both would rely heavily on Korean collaborators who shared their respective ideological orientations. In the American-occupied South, The United States Army military government in Korea, known as USAMJIK, faced enormous challenges in establishing effective administration. The American occupiers had little knowledge of Korean language, culture, or politics, and initially relied heavily on Japanese administrators and Korean officials who had served the colonial government. This decision proved deeply unpopular with most Koreans, who viewed these individuals as collaborators and traitors. The American military government also struggled to understand the complex political landscape of liberated Korea, where various groups competed for influence and legitimacy. The American military government's decision to retain Japanese administrators and Korean collaborators reflected practical necessities but created enormous political problems. American officers argued that these individuals possessed essential administrative experience and knowledge of Korean conditions that would be difficult to replace quickly. However, most Koreans viewed any association with colonial administration as morally compromising and politically illegitimate. This policy created immediate tensions between the American occupation authorities and Korean public opinion, undermining American credibility and providing ammunition for critics who questioned American commitment to Korean independence. The language barrier between American occupiers and Korean citizens created additional problems for the military government. Few American officers spoke Korean, while relatively few Koreans were fluent in English, making communication difficult and creating opportunities for misunderstanding and manipulation. American officials often relied on interpreters who had their own political agendas, while Korean citizens found it difficult to express their concerns and grievances to occupation authorities. These communication problems contributed to mutual suspicion and mistrust that would complicate American-Korean relationships throughout the occupation period. The political situation in southern Korea was chaotic and fragmented. Syngman Rhee, who had spent decades in exile in the United States, returned to Korea with American support and quickly emerged as a leading conservative politician. Rhee was a skilled politician who understood how to work with American officials, but he lacked a strong base of popular support within Korea itself. Other political leaders included Kim Gu, the former president of the Korean Provisional Government in China, who advocated for immediate independence and unification, and Yo Eun-haung, a moderate leftist who attempted to build bridges between different political factions. Syngman Rhee's return to Korea marked the beginning of a political career that would shape South Korean development for decades. Rhee had spent most of his adult life in the United States, earning a doctorate from Princeton University and developing extensive contacts with American political and religious leaders. His long residence in America had given him valuable insights into American political culture and democratic institutions, but it had also isolated him from developments within Korea during the colonial period. Many Koreans viewed Rhee as an outsider who lacked understanding of the struggles and sacrifices that Koreans had endured under Japanese rule. Kim Gu represented a different strand of Korean nationalism, one rooted in armed resistance to Japanese rule and commitment to immediate independence. As president of the Korean Provisional Government in China, Kim Gu had maintained Korean independence claims throughout the colonial period and had organized various resistance activities against Japanese forces. His credentials as a resistance leader gave him significant moral authority among Koreans, but his uncompromising positions on unification and his opposition to trusteeship made him a difficult partner for American occupation authorities. The communist movement in southern Korea was initially weak and disorganized, having been severely repressed during the colonial period. However, as economic conditions deteriorated and popular dissatisfaction with the American military government grew, leftist groups began to gain support, particularly among workers and peasants. The American occupiers viewed any communist or leftist activity with deep suspicion, leading to increasing political repression and the exclusion of leftist groups from the political process. The growth of leftist sentiment in southern Korea reflected genuine grievances about economic hardship and social inequality rather than simply Soviet manipulation. Many Koreans who had suffered under Japanese colonial exploitation were attracted to communist promises of land reform, worker rights, and social equality. The American military government's policies, which often seemed to favor wealthy landowners and former collaborators, reinforced these leftist appeals and created sympathy for communist alternatives among ordinary Koreans. In northern Korea, the Soviet occupation took a very different approach. The Soviet military administration worked closely with Korean communists who had fought alongside Soviet forces in Manchuria during the war against Japan. Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla leader who had spent years fighting the Japanese in Chinese territory, emerged as the Soviets' preferred Korean leader. Unlike the situation in the South, where American officials often seemed uncertain about their long-term goals, the Soviets appeared to have a clear vision of creating a communist state in northern Korea that would serve as a buffer against Western influence in East Asia. Kim Il-sung's rise to power in northern Korea was facilitated by Soviet support, but it also reflected his genuine credentials as an anti-Japanese resistance fighter. Unlike many southern Korean politicians who had spent the colonial period in exile or accommodation with Japanese rule, Kim Il-sung could claim to have fought actively against Japanese forces for over a decade. His guerrilla experience had given him valuable military and organizational skills, while his communist ideology provided a clear framework for post-liberation reconstruction and development. The Soviet approach to occupation was more systematic and ideologically driven than the American approach in the South. Soviet advisors worked to establish communist party structures, reorganize the economy along socialist lines, and eliminate potential opposition groups. Land reform was implemented quickly and thoroughly, redistributing property from Japanese colonists and Korean landlords to peasant farmers. This policy proved popular among the rural population and helped to consolidate communist control in the northern regions. The rapid implementation of land reform in northern Korea contrasted sharply with the slower and more limited reforms in the American-occupied South. Soviet advisors understood that land redistribution was essential for gaining peasant support and eliminating the economic base of potential opposition groups. The confiscation of Japanese-owned land was relatively uncontroversial, but the redistribution of property owned by Korean landlords created more complex political problems. However, the promise of land ownership proved attractive to landless peasants who had suffered under the colonial agricultural system. The economic challenges facing both occupation zones were enormous. Japanese colonial rule had integrated the Korean economy into the Japanese imperial system, with the northern regions specializing in heavy industry and mining while the southern regions focused on agriculture and light manufacturing. The division of the peninsula disrupted these economic relationships, creating shortages and economic hardship in both zones. The removal of Japanese capital, technology, and expertise also created significant problems for economic reconstruction. The disruption of inter-regional trade created immediate shortages of essential goods in both occupation zones. Northern Korea, which had specialized in industrial production, suddenly found itself cut off from southern agricultural products, while the South lost access to northern manufactured goods and electric power. These shortages created hardship for ordinary citizens and complicated the efforts of both occupation governments to maintain popular support and legitimacy. In the southern zone, the American military government struggled to address these economic challenges while also dealing with political instability and social unrest. Inflation was rampant, unemployment was high, and food shortages were common. The situation was made worse by the return of millions of Korean refugees from Japan, Manchuria, and other parts of the former Japanese Empire, creating additional pressure on already strained resources. Labor strikes and political demonstrations became increasingly common, often met with harsh repression by American and Korean police forces. The refugee crisis created enormous humanitarian and political challenges for both occupation zones. Millions of Koreans who had been forced to work in Japan, Manchuria, and other parts of the Japanese Empire began returning to Korea after liberation, often with few possessions and limited prospects for employment. Many refugees had been away from Korea for years or decades and found it difficult to readjust to changed conditions in their homeland. The occupation authorities struggled to provide adequate housing, food, and medical care for these refugees while also addressing the needs of Koreans who had remained in the country throughout the colonial period. The northern zone faced similar economic challenges but approached them differently under Soviet guidance. The communist authorities implemented central planning and state control of major industries, while also carrying out extensive land reform. These policies created their own problems, including bureaucratic inefficiency and resistance from some segments of the population, but they also provided a framework for systematic reconstruction efforts. The Soviet Union provided significant economic aid and technical assistance, helping to rebuild Northern Korea's industrial capacity. The contrasting economic approaches in the two occupation zones reflected broader ideological differences about the role of government in economic development. American advisors generally favored market-oriented solutions and private enterprise, while Soviet advisors emphasized state control and central planning. These different approaches produced different results and created different social and political dynamics in the two zones, contributing to the growing divergence between North and South Korea. As the months passed after liberation, it became increasingly clear that the temporary division of Korea was becoming permanent. Efforts to establish a unified Korean government through international negotiations repeatedly failed, as the United States and Soviet Union could not agree on the terms for unification. Each superpower insisted on political arrangements that would favor their respective Korean allies, making compromise impossible. The Korean people, who had expected rapid independence and unification after liberation, found themselves caught between two competing visions of their nation's future. The failure of the joint Soviet-American Commission, established to work toward Korean unification, marked a crucial turning point. The Commission met repeatedly in 1946 and 1947, but could not overcome the fundamental disagreements between the occupying powers. The Americans insisted on free elections throughout Korea, confident that anti-communist candidates would win in a democratic vote. The Soviets demanded a role for all political parties, including communists, in any future Korean government, knowing that their allies would likely be excluded in a purely democratic process dominated by conservative and moderate forces. The Commission's failure reflected broader Cold War tensions that were developing between the United States and Soviet Union in Europe and other parts of the world. Korea became a test case for post-war cooperation between the former wartime allies, but the ideological differences and mutual suspicions that were emerging made such cooperation increasingly difficult. Korean unification became hostage to global superpower competition, with Korean interests subordinated to broader strategic considerations. The establishment of separate governments in North and South Korea became inevitable as the Cold War intensified. In the South, the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea supervised elections in May 1948, leading to the establishment of the Republic of Korea under President Syngman Rhee. The northern authorities refused to participate in these elections, denouncing them as illegitimate, and instead established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung's leadership. By the end of 1948, two separate Korean states existed, each claiming to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. The UN-supervised elections in South Korea were intended to provide legitimacy for the new government, but they were boycotted by many leftist and moderate groups who opposed the permanent division of Korea. The elections were also marked by political violence and intimidation that raised questions about their fairness and representativeness. Despite these problems, the elections did provide a democratic mandate for Syngman Rhee's government and established South Korea as a functioning democracy, albeit one with significant limitations and problems. The creation of two Korean states represented a tragic outcome for the Korean people, who had dreamed of independence and unification after decades of colonial rule. Instead of achieving their goals of national sovereignty and self-determination, Koreans found themselves divided by an artificial boundary that separated families, communities, and economic regions. The ideological differences between the two Korean governments made peaceful reunification increasingly unlikely, while the involvement of the superpowers meant that Korean division was now part of the broader global struggle between capitalism and communism. The human cost of division became apparent immediately as families found themselves separated by the new border. The 38th parallel, which had been a meaningless line on a map, suddenly became an impermeable barrier that prevented normal communication and travel between North and South Korea. Families that had been temporarily separated by the chaos of liberation found themselves permanently divided, with no prospect of reunion or even communication across the border. The withdrawal of American and Soviet occupation forces in 1948 and 1949 did not end foreign involvement in Korean affairs. Both Korean governments remained heavily dependent on their respective superpower patrons for military, economic, and political support. The Republic of Korea relied on American aid and military advisors, while the Democratic People's Republic of Korea maintained close ties with the Soviet Union and increasingly with Communist China. These relationships would prove crucial in the events that followed. The continued dependence on foreign support reflected the weakness of both Korean governments and the artificial nature of the division. Neither government had sufficient resources or legitimacy to maintain itself without external assistance, making them vulnerable to pressure from their superpower patrons. This dependence also meant that Korean reunification would require agreement between the United States and Soviet Union, something that became increasingly unlikely as Cold War tensions intensified. Border incidents between North and South Korean forces became increasingly common as both governments sought to extend their control and test their opponent's resolve. Each side conducted raids and infiltration attempts across the 38th parallel, while also engaging in propaganda warfare and diplomatic efforts to gain international recognition. The situation was becoming increasingly unstable, with both Korean leaders making public statements about their intention to unify the peninsula under their respective systems. These border incidents created a cycle of escalation and retaliation that made peaceful resolution of the division increasingly difficult. Each side blamed the other for provocative actions, while using enemy provocations to justify their own military preparations and aggressive rhetoric. The growing militarization of the border created a dynamic that made war increasingly likely, as both sides prepared for what they saw as an inevitable confrontation. Kim Il-sung, confident in his military strength and believing he had Soviet support, began planning for a military solution to the division problem. The North Korean leader was convinced that a quick military strike could overwhelm South Korean forces before American intervention could become effective. Stalin, initially cautious about supporting such an adventure, eventually gave his approval, believing that American commitment to South Korea was limited and that a fait accompli could be achieved before significant American response. The decision to launch a military invasion reflected Kim Il-sung's impatience with diplomatic efforts and his confidence in North Korean military superiority. North Korean forces had been systematically built up with Soviet assistance and included many veterans of the Chinese Civil War who had gained valuable combat experience. Kim Il-sung believed that South Korean forces, which were less well-equipped and trained, would collapse quickly under determined attack, allowing North Korea to present the world with a unified Korea under communist rule. Syngman Rhee was equally committed to unification under his leadership, frequently making bellicose statements about marching north to liberate the communist-controlled regions. However, the South Korean military was weaker than its northern counterpart and lacked the heavy weapons and equipment necessary for offensive operations. American military advisors worked to build up South Korean capabilities while also trying to restrain Rhee from provocative actions that might trigger a larger conflict. The American policy of limiting South Korean military capabilities while building up defensive strength reflected concerns about Rhee's aggressive rhetoric and fear that South Korea might launch its own invasion of the North. American officials wanted to deter North Korean attack while avoiding actions that might provoke such an attack or enable South Korean aggression. This policy proved inadequate when North Korea decided to resolve the division through military force. The stage was being set for a catastrophic war that would devastate the Korean Peninsula and involve major powers from around the world. The division that had begun as a temporary administrative convenience was about to be written in blood and fire, creating a conflict that would last 3 years and establish a permanent state of hostility between the two Koreas that continues to this day. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel, beginning the Korean War. The attack came as a surprise to South Korean and American forces despite months of intelligence reports suggesting that North Korean military preparations were underway. The initial North Korean offensive was devastatingly effective, combining superior numbers, better equipment, and tactical surprise to overwhelm South Korean defenses along most of the front. The Korean War would prove to be one of the most destructive conflicts of the 20th century, involving not only the two Korean states but also major powers including the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. The war would devastate the Korean Peninsula, causing millions of casualties and destroying much of Korea's infrastructure and economic capacity. More tragically, the war would solidify the division of Korea, creating a heavily militarized border and a state of permanent hostility that would persist for decades. The dream of Korean reunification, which had seemed achievable in 1945, would be indefinitely postponed by 3 years of brutal warfare that would leave both Korean states exhausted, bitter, and more divided than ever before. The aftermath of the Korean War left both North and South Korea facing the monumental task of rebuilding their shattered nations from the ruins of 3 years of devastating conflict. The armistice signed at Panmunjom in July 1953 had ended the active fighting, but it had not brought peace. Instead, it had frozen the division of Korea in place, creating two separate states with fundamentally different visions of how to reconstruct their war-torn peninsula. The choices made during this critical period of post-war reconstruction would set both Koreas on divergent paths that would define their development for the next 7 decades and beyond. The scale of destruction across the Korean Peninsula was almost incomprehensible to those who witnessed it firsthand. Foreign correspondents and aid workers described landscapes that resembled the aftermath of natural disasters, with entire cities reduced to rubble and countryside scarred by bomb craters and abandoned military fortifications. The human cost had been equally staggering, with families torn apart, communities destroyed, and traditional social structures completely disrupted. Yet from this devastation would emerge two very different experiments in nation building that would captivate the attention of the world and provide contrasting models for post-colonial development. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung emerged from the war with his authority strengthened rather than weakened. Despite the enormous human and material costs of the conflict he had initiated, the devastation was almost incomprehensible. American bombing campaigns had targeted virtually every structure of any significance in North Korea, leaving cities like Pyongyang 90% destroyed. Industrial facilities that had been built during the Japanese colonial period lay in ruins, their machinery either destroyed by bombing or dismantled and removed by retreating forces. The agricultural sector had been devastated by the fighting, with irrigation systems destroyed and farmland contaminated by unexploded ordnance that would continue to claim lives for decades to come. Most tragically, North Korea had lost an estimated 10 to 15% of its entire population during the war, creating a demographic catastrophe that would affect the country for generations and leave deep psychological scars on the survivors. The immediate aftermath of the war presented Kim Il-sung with both enormous challenges and unique opportunities. The complete destruction of existing infrastructure meant that reconstruction could proceed, according to socialist principles, without the constraints of inherited capitalist institutions. The shared suffering of the war had created a sense of national unity and determination that could be channeled toward ambitious development goals. The presence of Chinese troops and Soviet advisors provided both security guarantees and technical expertise for reconstruction efforts. Most importantly, the war had demonstrated to the North Korean people the existential threat posed by capitalist encirclement, creating a siege mentality that would justify extraordinary sacrifices for national defense and development. Yet Kim Il-sung and the Korean Workers' Party leadership viewed this destruction as an opportunity to build their ideal socialist state from scratch. The reconstruction effort became a vehicle for consolidating political control and implementing their vision of a self-reliant, centrally planned economy based on heavy industry and collective agriculture. The North Korean leadership rejected both Soviet and Chinese models of socialism, instead developing what they called jochi, or self-reliance, as their guiding ideology. This philosophy emphasized Korean independence from foreign influence, while maintaining the essential structures of a communist state under Kim Il-sung's personal rule. The development of Jochi ideology during the Reconstruction period reflected both practical necessities and ideological convictions. Practically, North Korea needed to balance between its two major allies, China and the Soviet Union, who were increasingly at odds with each other over the proper interpretation of Marxist-Leninist doctrine. By developing its own ideological framework, North Korea could maintain relationships with both powers while preserving its autonomy in domestic affairs. Ideologically, Jochi appealed to Korean nationalism and pride, emphasizing the unique characteristics of Korean culture and history that required a distinctly Korean approach to socialism. The reconstruction of North Korea proceeded with remarkable speed in the immediate post-war years, aided by substantial assistance from China and the Soviet Union. Both communist powers had strategic interests in maintaining a strong ally on China's border and preventing the collapse of the North Korean state. Soviet aid focused primarily on heavy industry and military equipment, providing the technical expertise and machinery needed to rebuild North Korea's industrial base. Chinese assistance included both material support and hundreds of thousands of workers who helped rebuild North Korean infrastructure, sharing their experience in post-revolutionary reconstruction and providing crucial manpower for massive construction projects. The scale of foreign assistance was truly extraordinary by any measure. Soviet engineers designed and supervised the construction of major industrial complexes, while Chinese workers provided the labor force for everything from factory construction to road building. East European countries also contributed specialized equipment and technical knowledge in areas like mining and chemical production. This international socialist cooperation created a sense of solidarity and shared purpose that reinforced North Korea's commitment to the communist development model, while providing the resources needed for rapid reconstruction. The centerpiece of North Korean reconstruction was the development of heavy industry, particularly steel production, machine building, and chemical manufacturing. The leadership believed that building a strong industrial base was essential for both economic development and national defense, reflecting the Marxist principle that heavy industry formed the foundation of socialist economic development. Massive industrial complexes were constructed in cities like Hamhung, Chongjin, and Kimcheok, employing hundreds of thousands of workers in state-owned enterprises that became the backbone of the North Korean economy. These industrial projects were more than just economic investments. They were symbols of national pride and socialist achievement. The Hwanghae Iron and Steel Complex became a showcase of North Korean industrial capability, producing steel that was used in construction projects throughout the country. The Hungnam Fertilizer Factory demonstrated North Korea's commitment to agricultural modernization and food security. Each major project was accompanied by massive propaganda campaigns that celebrated the heroic efforts of workers and engineers, while emphasizing the superiority of socialist planning over capitalist market mechanisms. The emphasis on heavy industry reflected both ideological commitment to socialist economic principles and practical concerns about national security in a divided peninsula where military conflict could resume at any time. North Korean planners believed that a strong industrial base would provide the foundation for military production capability, while also generating the economic growth needed to improve living standards and demonstrate the superiority of the socialist system. This dual-purpose approach to industrial development would become a defining characteristic of North Korean economic strategy for decades to come. Agriculture was also completely reorganized along socialist lines during the Reconstruction period, representing perhaps the most fundamental transformation of North Korean society. Private farming was eliminated and replaced with collective farms called agricultural cooperatives, which were designed to increase agricultural productivity through mechanization and scientific farming methods while ensuring state control over food production and distribution. The collectivization process was completed by the late 1950s, fundamentally transforming rural life in North Korea and creating a system where the state controlled virtually every aspect of agricultural production. The agricultural transformation involved not just changes in land ownership, but a complete reorganization of rural society. Traditional village structures were replaced by cooperative organizations that combined farming with light manufacturing and other economic activities. Peasant families were relocated to new cooperative centers with modern housing, schools, and health clinics. Agricultural techniques were modernized through the introduction of tractors, chemical fertilizers, and new crop varieties developed by government research institutes. The results of agricultural collectivization were mixed but initially promising. Food production increased significantly during the 1950s as mechanization and scientific farming methods were applied on a large scale. The elimination of landlordism and the redistribution of land created a sense of social justice and equality that enhanced popular support for the government. Rural living standards improved as cooperative members gained access to education, healthcare, and consumer goods that had been unavailable under the traditional system. However, the collectivization process also created new problems that would become apparent in later decades. The elimination of individual incentives reduced agricultural productivity over time as farmers had little motivation to work efficiently or innovate. The emphasis on grain production at the expense of other crops created nutritional imbalances and reduced dietary diversity. Most importantly, the state's control over food distribution created a system of dependence that could be used to ensure political compliance, but also made the population vulnerable to policy mistakes and natural disasters. The political system that emerged during Reconstruction was characterized by increasing centralization of power under Kim Il-sung's personal authority. The Korean Workers' Party became the sole political organization permitted to operate, with all other parties and civil society organizations either eliminated or absorbed into party-controlled mass organizations. The state security apparatus was expanded dramatically, with multiple intelligence and surveillance organizations monitoring the population for any signs of dissent or disloyalty. This period saw the establishment of the political classification system that would categorize all North Korean citizens based on their family background and perceived loyalty to the regime. The development of this comprehensive surveillance state reflected both the leadership's paranoia about potential threats and their determination to maintain absolute control over the reconstruction process. Every North Korean citizen was assigned to a political category based on their family's actions during the Japanese colonial period and the Korean War. Those classified as having good political backgrounds received preferential treatment in education, employment, and housing, while those with questionable backgrounds faced discrimination and surveillance. This system created powerful incentives for political conformity while dividing the population into competing groups that were unlikely to cooperate in opposition to the government. The personality cult around Kim Il-sung also began to take shape during this period, as the leadership sought to create a unifying symbol that could mobilize popular support for the enormous sacrifices required by rapid industrialization. Kim Il-sung was portrayed not just as a political leader, but as the father of the nation and the embodiment of Korean national aspirations. His image appeared in every public building and private home, while his writings became required study material for all citizens. This cult of personality served both to legitimize the government's authority and to create emotional bonds between the population and the political system. Education and culture were completely restructured to serve the needs of the socialist state and promote loyalty to Kim Il-sung and the Korean Workers' Party. The education system emphasized technical and scientific training to support industrial development, while also providing intensive political indoctrination from elementary school through university. Traditional Korean culture was selectively preserved and modified to support state ideology, with emphasis placed on Korean national identity while eliminating elements deemed feudal or bourgeois. The media became a tool for political education and mobilization, with newspapers, radio, and later television serving primarily to disseminate party propaganda and encourage popular participation in economic development campaigns. The transformation of education represented one of the most successful aspects of North Korean Reconstruction. Literacy rates increased dramatically as schools were built in every village, and attendance became universal. Technical education expanded rapidly to provide the skilled workers needed for industrial development. Higher education was reorganized to emphasize engineering, science, and other fields relevant to economic modernization. By the end of the 1950s, North Korea had created an educated population capable of supporting continued economic growth and technological development. Cultural policy was more complex and controversial, as the government sought to promote Korean national identity while eliminating traditional elements that conflicted with socialist ideology. Traditional music and dance were preserved, but modified to include revolutionary themes and messages. Literature and art were required to serve political purposes and celebrate socialist achievements. Religious practices were suppressed or eliminated as incompatible with scientific socialism. This cultural transformation created a distinctive North Korean identity that combined Korean nationalism with socialist ideology, though at the cost of cultural diversity and artistic freedom. Meanwhile, South Korea faced its own enormous challenges in the aftermath of the Korean War. The destruction in the South had been less comprehensive than in the North, but still devastating. Seoul had changed hands 4 times during the war and suffered enormous damage, with most government buildings, schools, and hospitals destroyed or severely damaged. Much of the country's limited industrial infrastructure had been destroyed or severely damaged, leaving South Korea even more dependent on agriculture than it had been before the war. The agricultural sector had been disrupted by the fighting, creating food shortages that persisted well into the 1950s and forced the government to rely on American food aid to prevent famine. Perhaps most challenging of all, South Korea had to cope with millions of refugees from North Korea who had fled south during the war, creating enormous social and economic pressures. These refugees arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, requiring immediate assistance for housing, food, and medical care. Many had lost family members during their flight south and faced an uncertain future in an unfamiliar environment. The integration of these refugees became one of the most pressing social challenges facing the South Korean government during the Reconstruction period. The refugee crisis also created opportunities as well as challenges. Many North Korean refugees brought valuable skills and knowledge that contributed to South Korean development. Former North Korean professionals, including doctors, engineers, and teachers, helped staff South Korea's expanding educational and healthcare systems. Entrepreneurs who had operated businesses in North Korea before the war established new enterprises in the South. The shared experience of displacement and loss also created bonds of solidarity among refugees and between refugees and South Korean citizens that helped forge a common national identity. The political situation in South Korea during the Reconstruction period was dominated by President Syngman Rhee, who had consolidated his authority during the war and showed little inclination to democratize his government afterward. Rhee's administration was characterized by authoritarianism, corruption, and increasing repression of political opposition. While South Korea was nominally a democracy with a constitution and elections, Rhee manipulated the political system to maintain power and suppress dissent. His government's legitimacy rested primarily on anti-communist credentials and American support rather than popular approval or democratic governance. Rhee's authoritarian rule reflected both his personal inclinations and the challenging circumstances facing South Korea during Reconstruction. The president argued that democratic competition was a luxury that the country could not afford, while facing an existential threat from North Korea and struggling to rebuild from wartime destruction. Political opposition was portrayed as potentially treasonous, while critics of government policy were accused of communist sympathies. This siege mentality justified restrictions on civil liberties and democratic participation that would persist throughout the 1950s. The corruption that characterized Rhee's government was both a cause and consequence of weak democratic institutions. Government officials used their positions to enrich themselves and their supporters, while businesses sought political connections to gain access to American aid and government contracts. This system of crony capitalism created enormous inefficiencies in resource allocation while generating popular resentment against the government. The lack of accountability and transparency also made it difficult to implement effective development policies or respond to popular needs and concerns. Economically, South Korea in the 1950s remained primarily agricultural and desperately poor. The country lacked significant natural resources and had limited industrial capacity, making it heavily dependent on American aid for basic necessities. Most of the population lived in rural areas and engaged in subsistence farming using traditional methods that produced barely enough food for survival. Urban areas were characterized by widespread poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing for the millions of war refugees who had crowded into cities seeking safety and opportunity. The economic challenges facing South Korea were compounded by the division of the peninsula, which had separated the country from important natural resources and industrial facilities located in the north. The colonial economy had been integrated across the entire peninsula, with raw materials from the north processed in factories in the south. The division disrupted these economic relationships and forced both parts of Korea to develop more self-sufficient economies. For South Korea, this meant starting almost from scratch in building an industrial base while lacking many of the natural resources that had supported economic development in other countries. American aid to South Korea during the Reconstruction period was substantial but came with strings attached. The United States provided billions of dollars in economic and military assistance, making South Korea one of the largest recipients of American foreign aid during the 1950s. However, American officials insisted on significant influence over South Korean economic and political policies, creating tensions between American desires for economic efficiency and political democratization and South Korean priorities for rapid reconstruction and political stability. The aid relationship also reinforced South Korea's position in the American sphere of influence and its integration into the global capitalist economy. The structure of American aid reflected both humanitarian concerns and strategic objectives. Food aid prevented famine and malnutrition among the South Korean population, while infrastructure assistance helped rebuild roads, bridges, and public buildings destroyed during the war. Military aid provided the equipment and training needed to defend against potential North Korean aggression. However, much of the aid was also designed to promote American political and economic interests, including support for democratic institutions and market-oriented economic policies. The aid relationship created both opportunities and dependencies that would shape South Korean development for decades. On the positive side, American assistance provided the resources needed for basic reconstruction and created connections to global markets and technology that would prove valuable for later development. American educational assistance helped train South Korean professionals and expose them to modern management and technical practices. However, the aid relationship also created dependencies that limited South Korean autonomy in domestic and foreign policy, while generating resentment among some Koreans who viewed American influence as a form of neocolonialism. The reconstruction efforts in South Korea were hampered by political instability and social conflict that reflected both the traumatic war experience and the challenges of building democratic institutions in a poor, divided country. Rhee's increasingly authoritarian rule generated growing opposition from students, intellectuals, and political rivals who demanded democratic reforms and honest government. Labor unrest was common as workers struggled with low wages and poor working conditions while watching government officials and their cronies enrich themselves through corruption. The presence of hundreds of thousands of American troops created additional social tensions, particularly in areas around military bases where cultural conflicts and economic disparities were most apparent. Regional conflicts between different parts of the country, which had historical roots but were exacerbated by the war experience, also complicated national unity efforts. Competition between Seoul and other regions for government investment and attention created political tensions that were exploited by both government and opposition politicians. The integration of refugees from North Korea also created social tensions as established communities struggled to accommodate newcomers who often had different dialects, customs, and expectations. Despite these challenges, South Korea began to show signs of economic recovery by the late 1950s. Agricultural production gradually returned to pre-war levels, helped by land reform programs that distributed property from large landowners to tenant farmers. These land reforms, while limited in scope, created a more equitable distribution of rural wealth and provided incentives for increased agricultural productivity. Small-scale manufacturing began to develop, particularly in textiles and other light industries that could take advantage of South Korea's abundant labor supply and growing domestic market. Educational opportunities expanded significantly during the Reconstruction period, with both government and private organizations establishing schools and universities to train the skilled workers needed for economic development. The emphasis on education reflected both traditional Korean values that prized learning and practical recognition that human capital development was essential for economic growth. American assistance supported educational expansion through funding for school construction, teacher training, and curriculum development that introduced modern educational methods and content. The expansion of education had profound social and economic consequences that would become apparent in later decades. Universal primary education created a literate population capable of participating in modern economic activities. Secondary education provided the technical skills needed for industrial development. Higher education produced the professionals and managers needed to lead economic modernization efforts. Perhaps most importantly, education created social mobility opportunities that helped maintain popular support for the government despite economic hardships and political restrictions. The contrast between North and South Korean Reconstruction strategies reflected their different ideological orientations and international alignments. North Korea pursued rapid industrialization through central planning and state ownership, emphasizing heavy industry and military production. This approach achieved impressive short-term growth rates and created a sense of national purpose and achievement that enhanced regime legitimacy. The comprehensive nature of state control allowed for rapid mobilization of resources toward priority objectives, while ensuring that the benefits of growth were distributed according to political criteria rather than market mechanisms. South Korea's reconstruction proceeded more slowly and with greater difficulty, constrained by political instability, limited resources, and the challenges of building market institutions from scratch. However, the South Korean approach maintained connections to the global economy and preserved some elements of market mechanisms that would prove important for later development. The emphasis on education and human capital development, even during the difficult Reconstruction years, laid important foundations for future economic growth that would eventually surpass North Korean achievements. The ideological competition between the two Korean states intensified during the Reconstruction period, as each sought to prove the superiority of its chosen development model. North Korea pointed to its rapid industrial growth and comprehensive social services as evidence that socialism could deliver prosperity and equality while maintaining national independence. South Korea emphasized its political freedoms and connections to the developed world as advantages over the communist North. Though these arguments were weakened by the authoritarian nature of Ri's government and the country's continued poverty and dependence on foreign aid, this competition was not merely rhetorical, but had practical consequences for policy choices in both countries. North Korean leaders felt pressure to demonstrate rapid progress in industrialization and social development to validate their revolutionary credentials and maintain popular support. South Korean leaders faced similar pressures to show economic progress and political legitimacy to compete with North Korean achievements and maintain American support. This competitive dynamic encouraged ambitious development programs in both countries, while also creating incentives for propaganda and exaggeration of actual achievements. The international context of the Cold War profoundly shaped Reconstruction efforts in both Koreas, as each became a proxy for broader ideological competition between capitalism and communism. North Korea benefited from substantial assistance from China and the Soviet Union, but this support came with expectations of political loyalty and ideological conformity that limited North Korean autonomy in domestic and foreign policy. South Korea received massive American aid, but had to accept American influence over its domestic and foreign policies, while also serving American strategic interests in East Asia. The Cold War context also meant that both Korean states were viewed by their respective allies as testing grounds for alternative development models. The success or failure of Korean Reconstruction efforts would be interpreted as evidence for the superiority of either capitalist or communist approaches to development. This international attention brought additional resources and expertise to both countries, but also created pressures for rapid results that sometimes led to inefficient or unsustainable policies. By the end of the 1950s, both North and South Korea had achieved significant reconstruction from the devastation of the Korean War, but they had done so in fundamentally different ways that set them on divergent development paths. North Korea had built a centralized socialist state with impressive industrial capacity, but limited political freedom and growing isolation from the global economy. The country had achieved food security, universal education and healthcare, and rapid industrial growth that provided a foundation for continued development. However, these achievements had come at the cost of individual freedom and economic flexibility that would prove increasingly problematic in later decades. South Korea remained politically unstable and economically dependent, but had maintained connections to international markets and preserved some democratic institutions that would prove important for future development. The country had achieved basic reconstruction and modest economic growth while building educational and institutional foundations that would support more rapid development in subsequent decades. However, South Korea still faced enormous challenges in overcoming poverty, achieving political stability, and reducing dependence on foreign assistance. The Reconstruction period established patterns of development that would characterize both Korean states for decades to come. North Korea's emphasis on self-reliance and central planning would eventually lead to economic stagnation and increasing isolation as the limitations of this approach became apparent. South Korea's integration into the global economy and gradual democratization would create the foundations for remarkable economic growth and political development that would transform the country into a prosperous democracy. The choices made during these crucial years of post-war reconstruction would ultimately determine which Korean state would achieve greater prosperity and international influence in the decades that followed. The legacy of the Reconstruction period continues to influence both Korean states today, as the institutions, policies, and social structures established during this critical time have proven remarkably durable. The divergent paths chosen by North and South Korea during Reconstruction created different political cultures, economic systems, and social values that persist despite decades of subsequent change and development. Understanding this formative period remains essential for comprehending the contemporary challenges and opportunities facing both Korean states as they continue to evolve in an increasingly interconnected world. The 1960s marked a critical turning point in the development of both Korean states as they moved beyond basic reconstruction toward more ambitious goals of economic modernization and social transformation. This decade would witness the beginning of what would later be called economic miracles in both countries, though these achievements would take dramatically different forms and have vastly different long-term consequences for their respective populations. The competition between the two development models intensified during this period, with each side claiming superior results and seeking to attract international attention and support for their approach to modernization. The global context of the 1960s provided both opportunities and challenges for Korean development. The world economy was experiencing unprecedented growth, creating expanding markets for manufactured goods and new opportunities for developing countries to participate in international trade. Technological advances were accelerating the pace of innovation and creating new industries that could potentially be developed by countries with appropriate skills and resources. However, the Cold War was also intensifying, creating security challenges and forcing both Korean states to allocate significant resources to military preparedness rather than economic development. In North Korea, the 1960s represented the peak of the country's economic performance under the socialist development model. Building on the industrial foundation established during Reconstruction, North Korea achieved remarkable economic growth rates that impressed international observers and seemed to validate the effectiveness of centrally planned development. The economy expanded at an average annual rate of over 10% during the first half of the decade, driven primarily by continued expansion of heavy industry and the development of new sectors like petrochemicals and electronics manufacturing. The success of North Korean economic development during this period was built on several key factors that distinguished it from other socialist countries and developing nations. First, the country continued to receive substantial assistance from both China and the Soviet Union. though Kim Il-sung skillfully played these two communist powers against each other to maximize North Korean independence and benefits. This diplomatic balancing act allowed North Korea to access technology and resources from both allies while avoiding the political constraints that might have come from dependence on either one alone. Second, the highly centralized planning system allowed for rapid mobilization of resources toward priority sectors, enabling dramatic increases in industrial production capacity that would have been difficult to achieve through market mechanisms. The state could direct investment, allocate labor, and coordinate production across different industries in ways that maximized synergies and minimized waste. This comprehensive approach to economic planning was particularly effective during the early stages of industrialization, when the main challenge was building basic production capacity rather than achieving efficiency or innovation. Third, the North Korean workforce was highly motivated by a combination of nationalist pride, ideological commitment, and effective propaganda campaigns that portrayed economic development as essential for national survival and reunification. Workers were encouraged to view their labor as contributions to national defense and socialist construction, rather than merely means of earning income. This sense of collective purpose generated extraordinary levels of effort and sacrifice that contributed significantly to economic achievements during this period. The centerpiece of North Korean economic strategy during the 1960s was the development of what the leadership called a comprehensive industrial base. This meant not only expanding existing heavy industries like steel and machinery production, but also developing new sectors that would make North Korea less dependent on imports from other countries. Chemical plants were built to produce fertilizers for agriculture and synthetic materials for industry, reducing dependence on expensive imports while creating the foundation for further industrial development. Electronics factories were established to manufacture consumer goods and military equipment, representing North Korea's entry into more technologically sophisticated industries. These facilities initially produced simple products like radios and basic electronic components, but they provided valuable experience and training that would support more advanced production in later years. The electronics industry also had important military applications, as the same technologies used for consumer products could be adapted for communications equipment and weapons systems. Mining operations were expanded to exploit North Korea's significant mineral resources, including coal, iron ore, and various rare metals that were essential for industrial production. The development of mining created employment opportunities in remote regions while providing raw materials for domestic industry and export earnings from sales to other socialist countries. The emphasis on resource extraction reflected the leadership's commitment to self-reliance and their recognition that natural resources could provide a foundation for continued economic development. Agriculture also underwent significant modernization during this period through mechanization and the application of scientific farming methods. The state invested heavily in agricultural machinery, purchasing tractors, combines, and other equipment from socialist allies while also developing domestic production capacity. Irrigation systems were expanded and improved to increase the reliability of agricultural production and reduce dependence on weather conditions. Chemical fertilizers were applied extensively to increase crop yields, though this would later create environmental problems that were not fully understood at the time. New varieties of rice and other crops were developed through government research programs that employed teams of scientists and technicians to improve agricultural productivity. These research efforts achieved some notable successes, including the development of rice varieties that could grow in North Korea's relatively short growing season and cold climate. Agricultural research was also directed toward developing crops that could serve multiple purposes, such as providing both food for human consumption and raw materials for industrial production. The collective farm system was refined and expanded during this period, with larger cooperative farms that could take advantage of economies of scale and modern farming techniques. These larger units were better able to support mechanization and scientific farming methods, while also providing social services like schools and health clinics for rural residents. The cooperative farms also served as vehicles for political education and social control, ensuring that rural populations remained loyal to the government and committed to socialist development goals. These agricultural efforts succeeded in achieving food self-sufficiency for the first time since the Korean War, eliminating the need for food imports and creating a sense of national achievement that enhanced regime legitimacy. The ability to feed the population without foreign assistance was particularly important for a country committed to self-reliance and suspicious of dependence on external sources of support. Food security also freed up resources that could be devoted to industrial development and military preparedness rather than agricultural imports. The social transformation that accompanied North Korea's economic development was equally dramatic and far-reaching. The education system was expanded massively, with particular emphasis on technical and scientific training needed to support industrial development. New universities and technical colleges were established to produce engineers, scientists, and skilled workers for the expanding economy. By the mid-1960s, North Korea had achieved nearly universal literacy and was producing large numbers of engineers, technicians, and skilled workers who could support continued economic growth and technological advancement. Healthcare was also universalized during this period, with the state providing free medical care to all citizens through a network of hospitals and clinics that reached even remote rural areas. This comprehensive healthcare system was both a source of popular support for the government and a practical necessity for maintaining a healthy workforce capable of supporting rapid economic development. The emphasis on preventive medicine and public health measures helped control infectious diseases and improve overall population health in ways that contributed to economic productivity. Urban development proceeded rapidly as industrial expansion created millions of new jobs in cities and towns throughout North Korea. Pyongyang was rebuilt as a showcase socialist capital with wide boulevards, monumental architecture, and modern apartment buildings for workers that demonstrated the achievements of socialist construction. The city's reconstruction was designed to impress both domestic and international audiences with the success of North Korean development, while providing improved living conditions for the political and technical elite who were essential for continued economic growth. Other industrial cities were also modernized during this period, with new housing, schools, and cultural facilities for the growing urban population. These urban development projects created employment opportunities in construction and related industries while improving living standards for industrial workers. The provision of modern housing, education, and cultural facilities in industrial cities helped attract workers from rural areas and maintain their productivity and loyalty to the socialist system. The standard of living for ordinary North Koreans improved significantly during this period, with better housing, more consumer goods, and expanded educational and cultural opportunities becoming available to broader segments of the population. While still modest by international standards, these improvements represented dramatic progress from the poverty and deprivation of the immediate post-war years. The availability of consumer goods like bicycles, watches, and household appliances provided tangible evidence of economic progress while creating incentives for continued hard work and political loyalty. However, this economic success came at the cost of increasing political control and social regimentation that would have long-term consequences for North Korean society. The Korean Workers' Party expanded its presence in every aspect of society, with party cells in workplaces, schools, and residential areas monitoring the population and ensuring compliance with state policies. This comprehensive surveillance system was justified as necessary for maintaining social order and political unity during rapid economic transformation, but it also eliminated individual autonomy and created a climate of fear and suspicion. The personality cult around Kim Il-sung reached new heights during this period, with his image and teachings becoming omnipresent in public spaces and daily life. Every North Korean was required to study Kim Il-sung's writings and participate in regular political education sessions that reinforced loyalty to the leader and commitment to socialist development goals. This cult of personality served to legitimize the government's authority while creating emotional bonds between the population and the political system that went beyond rational calculation of costs and benefits. Political dissent was not tolerated under any circumstances, and the state security apparatus was expanded to identify and eliminate any potential opposition to the regime. The political classification system that had been established during Reconstruction was refined and expanded to create more detailed categories of political reliability. Citizens with questionable political backgrounds faced discrimination in employment, education, and housing, while those with good backgrounds received preferential treatment that created incentives for political conformity. The international isolation of North Korea also began to increase during the 1960s as the country pursued its Juche ideology of self-reliance more aggressively. While maintaining relationships with China and the Soviet Union, North Korea reduced its engagement with other countries and became increasingly suspicious of foreign influence. This isolation was partly a response to the intensifying Cold War and the perceived threat from American and South Korean military forces, but it also reflected ideological commitment to independence and self-sufficiency that would eventually become counterproductive for continued economic development. The reduction in international engagement had both positive and negative consequences for North Korean development. On the positive side, it reduced dependence on foreign countries and created incentives for domestic innovation and self-sufficiency that strengthened national capabilities. The emphasis on developing domestic alternatives to imported goods and technologies fostered creativity and problem-solving skills that contributed to economic achievements. However, isolation also meant that North Korea was increasingly cut off from technological advances and management practices being developed elsewhere, which would eventually become a serious constraint on continued growth and competitiveness. Meanwhile, South Korea was experiencing its own dramatic transformation during the 1960s, though through a very different path that would ultimately prove more sustainable and successful. The decade began with the overthrow of Syngman Rhee's government in 1960 following massive student demonstrations against electoral fraud and authoritarian rule. This April Revolution, as it became known, brought hope for democratic development and political reform among students, intellectuals, and other groups who had been suppressed under Rhee's authoritarian rule. The student demonstrations that brought down Rhee's government represented a watershed moment in South Korean political development, demonstrating the power of popular mobilization and the limits of authoritarian control in an increasingly educated and urbanized society. The protesters demanded not only political reform but also honest government and economic policies that would benefit ordinary citizens rather than corrupt officials and their business allies. The success of these demonstrations inspired hopes for democratic development that would persist despite subsequent setbacks and disappointments. However, the new democratic government that emerged from the April Revolution proved unstable and ineffective in addressing South Korea's enormous economic and social challenges. The Chang Mayun administration lacked strong leadership and was hampered by political divisions and economic difficulties that made effective governance nearly impossible. Political parties were fragmented and focused more on personal rivalries than policy differences. Economic growth remained slow while unemployment and poverty persisted, creating popular dissatisfaction with democratic government that would be exploited by military leaders seeking to justify authoritarian rule. The democratic government lasted only about a year before being overthrown by a military coup led by General Park Chung-hee in May 1961. This coup was initially unpopular among students and intellectuals who had fought for democracy, but it gained support as Park and his military colleagues promised to clean up corruption and achieve rapid economic development that would improve living standards for ordinary citizens. The military government's emphasis on economic modernization and national strength appealed to many South Koreans who were frustrated with continued poverty and weakness compared to North Korea. Park Chung-hee's seizure of power marked the beginning of a new era in South Korean development characterized by authoritarian rule combined with aggressive economic modernization. Park and his military colleagues believed that South Korea's survival and prosperity required rapid economic growth to catch up with North Korea and demonstrate the superiority of the capitalist development model. They were willing to sacrifice political freedom and democratic governance to achieve this economic transformation, arguing that democracy was a luxury that poor countries could not afford. The Park government's approach to development reflected both practical considerations and ideological commitments that would shape South Korean economic policy for decades. Practically, the government recognized that South Korea lacked the natural resources and capital needed for heavy industry development, requiring a different approach from the North Korean model. Ideologically, Park and his advisors were committed to market mechanisms and private enterprise, though they believed that strong government guidance was necessary to overcome market failures and coordinate development efforts. The Park government implemented a series of ambitious economic development plans that fundamentally restructured the South Korean economy and society. The first five-year plan, launched in 1962, focused on developing light manufacturing industries that could take advantage of South Korea's abundant labor supply and growing connections to global markets. Textile production, electronics assembly, and other labor-intensive industries were promoted through government subsidies, tax incentives, and infrastructure development that created conditions for rapid industrial growth. This export-oriented development strategy represented a dramatic departure from the import substitution approach that had characterized South Korean economic policy during the 1950s. Instead of trying to produce everything domestically, South Korea would specialize in manufacturing goods for export to developed countries, using the foreign exchange earned to import raw materials and capital goods needed for further industrial development. This strategy required close integration with the global economy and acceptance of South Korea's comparative advantage in labor-intensive production. The implementation of export-oriented development required significant changes in government policies and institutions. Trade barriers were reduced to facilitate imports of raw materials and capital goods, while export promotion agencies were established to help South Korean companies identify foreign markets and meet international quality standards. The exchange rate was adjusted to make South Korean exports more competitive in international markets. Most importantly, the government provided targeted support for industries and companies that showed promise for export success. The results of this new economic strategy were remarkable by any measure. South Korean exports grew from just $55 million in 1962 to over $1 billion by 1970, representing an extraordinary rate of growth that few countries have ever achieved. Manufacturing employment expanded rapidly, drawing millions of people from rural areas to work in new factories in cities like Seoul, Busan, and Incheon. The gross domestic product grew at an average annual rate of over 9% during the 1960s, transforming South Korea from one of the world's poorest countries into a middle-income developing nation. The rapid economic growth was accompanied by significant structural changes in the South Korean economy that created the foundation for continued development in subsequent decades. The share of agriculture in total economic output declined rapidly as industry and services expanded, reflecting the successful transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy. Productivity increased dramatically as workers acquired new skills and companies adopted modern production methods. Most importantly, the economy became increasingly integrated with global markets, creating opportunities for continued growth and technological advancement. The social transformation that accompanied South Korea's economic miracle was profound and often traumatic for individuals and communities caught up in rapid change. Millions of rural Koreans migrated to cities in search of factory jobs, creating massive urban growth and social dislocation that disrupted traditional family structures and community relationships. Traditional ways of life that had persisted for centuries were abandoned within a single generation as people adapted to industrial work and urban living. Women entered the industrial workforce in large numbers during this period, particularly in textile and electronics factories where their manual dexterity and attention to detail were valued by employers. This economic participation gave women greater independence and opportunities than they had enjoyed in traditional rural society, though they also faced exploitation and discrimination in workplaces dominated by male managers and traditional attitudes about gender roles. The experience of industrial work would eventually contribute to changing attitudes about women's capabilities and rights that would support greater gender equality in later decades. Traditional family structures and social relationships were disrupted as young people left their home villages and adopted new urban lifestyles. Extended families that had provided social support and economic security for generations were broken up as family members scattered to different cities in search of employment opportunities. New forms of social organization emerged in urban areas, including labor unions, religious organizations, and neighborhood associations that helped people adapt to industrial society and maintain social connections. Education became a national obsession during this period as South Koreans recognized that human capital development was essential for continued economic growth and social mobility. The government invested heavily in expanding educational opportunities at all levels, while families made enormous sacrifices to ensure their children could attend school and university. This emphasis on education reflected both traditional Korean values that prized learning and practical recognition that education was the key to escaping poverty and achieving success in the modern economy. The expansion of education had profound consequences for South Korean society and economic development. Universal primary education created a literate population capable of participating in modern economic activities and democratic governance. Secondary education provided the technical skills needed for industrial work and created a pool of qualified workers for expanding industries. Higher education produced the professionals and managers needed to lead economic modernization efforts while also creating an educated middle class with democratic aspirations that would eventually challenge authoritarian rule. The Park government's authoritarian rule became increasingly harsh as economic development proceeded and political opposition grew. Political dissidents were imprisoned, censorship was intensified, and civil liberties were further restricted in the name of maintaining political stability during rapid economic transformation. The government justified these measures as necessary for protecting South Korea from North Korean subversion, while also maintaining social order during the difficult transition to a modern industrial economy. The suppression of political opposition was accompanied by efforts to mobilize popular support for economic development through propaganda campaigns and mass organizations that promoted national unity and commitment to modernization goals. The government portrayed economic development as a patriotic duty and emphasized the need for sacrifice and hard work to achieve national prosperity. These appeals were effective in generating popular support for government policies, though they also created expectations for continued improvement in living standards that would become politically important in later years. Labor relations during this period were characterized by government control and suppression of independent union activity. The government established state-controlled unions that were supposed to represent worker interests while also supporting national development goals. Strikes were prohibited and labor disputes were resolved through government mediation rather than collective bargaining. While this system maintained industrial peace and supported rapid economic growth, it also created grievances among workers that would eventually lead to demands for greater labor rights and democratic participation. International relationships played a crucial role in South Korea's economic transformation during the 1960s. The normalization of relations with Japan in 1965, despite enormous popular opposition due to historical grievances from the colonial period, provided access to Japanese technology, capital, and markets that proved essential for industrial development. Japanese companies invested in South Korean manufacturing and provided technical assistance that helped South Korean firms improve their production capabilities and quality standards. The expansion of American military presence during the Vietnam War also brought significant economic benefits to South Korea through military contracts and construction projects that provided employment and foreign exchange earnings. South Korean companies gained valuable experience in international contracting while also developing capabilities that would later be applied to civilian construction projects in other countries. The Vietnam War period thus provided both economic opportunities and practical experience that contributed to South Korea's emerging role as an international contractor and exporter. The relationship with the United States remained crucial for South Korea's security and economic development, though it also created dependencies and constraints that limited South Korean autonomy in some policy areas. American military assistance provided security guarantees that allowed South Korea to focus resources on economic development rather than defense spending. American economic assistance and market access supported South Korean export industries. However, American influence also limited South Korean foreign policy options and created expectations for political democratization that sometimes conflicted with the Park government's authoritarian practices. The contrast between North and South Korean development strategies during the 1960s highlighted the fundamental differences between socialist and capitalist approaches to economic modernization. North Korea achieved impressive growth through central planning and state investment in heavy industry, creating a comprehensive industrial base and universal social services that provided security and stability for the population. The North Korean approach emphasized self-reliance and national independence while providing rapid improvements in living standards and social services. South Korea pursued export-oriented development through market mechanisms and integration with the global economy, achieving rapid growth in manufacturing and rising living standards through participation in international trade. The South Korean approach emphasized efficiency and competitiveness while accepting dependence on foreign markets and technology. Both countries achieved remarkable economic transformation during the decade, but through fundamentally different methods that reflected their different ideological orientations and international alignments. However, the sustainability and long-term consequences of these different approaches were already becoming apparent by the end of the 1960s. North Korea's isolation and emphasis on heavy industry were creating inefficiencies and technological backwardness that would eventually constrain continued growth. South Korea's integration with the global economy and emphasis on export competitiveness were creating flexibility and adaptability that would support continued development even as economic conditions changed. The success of both Korean development models during the 1960s created optimism about the future and confidence in their respective approaches to modernization. North Korea seemed to prove that socialist planning could deliver rapid industrialization and social progress while maintaining national independence and ideological purity. South Korea demonstrated that capitalist development could transform a poor agricultural country into a modern industrial nation through market mechanisms and international integration. This competition between alternative development models continued throughout the following decades, with each side claiming superiority and seeking to attract international support for their approach. However, the foundations laid during the 1960s would ultimately prove more sustainable in South Korea than in North Korea, as South Korea's integration into the global economy and emphasis on human capital development created flexibility and adaptability that would serve the country well as economic conditions changed in subsequent decades. The 1960s thus represented a crucial period in the divergent development of the two Korean states. Both achieved remarkable economic transformation and social modernization, but through very different paths that would ultimately lead to very different outcomes in terms of prosperity, freedom, and international influence. The choices made during this decade of rapid change established patterns of development that would persist well into the 21st century and continue to shape the destinies of both Korean peoples.